Hey guys, Mr. Jalapeno here with another episode of Jalapeno Drywall. And on today's project, I'm going to show you how I repaired this damage here on the ceiling above the island in the kitchen. The kids splashed a little bit too much water from the bathroom upstairs. It did cause a little bit of water damage, so I'm going to show you step by step on how I fixed it. So the first thing I did was make this Dexter containment. That way I keep all the mess inside there. And just to make sure everything's dry, I'm going to be using this moisture meter. That way I could check and make sure there's no excess moisture in the drywall. I just got this and it actually works really good. You could use it on wood and drywall and other materials as well. All you have to do is just insert the pins into the drywall, and as you can see, it's super dry because look, once I put my finger on it, it reads the moisture just on my finger, so I know this is super dry. Next, I'm going to get my utility blade, and as you can see, the tape did end up bubbling due to the water. I'm just going to cut that off just because if I just apply mud over that bubbling tape, it's going to bubble again, and it's just not going to look good. The good thing is that the water damage wasn't as severe because a lot of the times you might have to replace the drywall if it gets too saturated. And as you can see here, I'm just creating a beveled edge, that way I could get mud into the seam. And I'm also removing a lot of the loose material, that way the mud adheres better and there's not going to be issues down the line. I am going to be using hot mud for this repair, but I'll show you that a little bit later. The next thing I did was remove the screws that were sticking out, and then I used my stud finder just to make sure that the eye joist goes all the way along the seam. That way I could put some screws. As you can see, it tightens everything up. You always want to make sure that you don't put the screws in too deep. You just want a little dimple. For that hole there, I am going to be adding a little piece of drywall. I didn't have to add any backing just because the joist was there, and now it's hot mud time. On this step, I'm going to mix the hot mud to a consistency of like peanut butter. I don't want it to be too watery because it'll just fall off. And if it's too hard, it's going to be very difficult to apply. So just in the middle, like a peanut butter, like I said. Then I'm going to be using my 6-inch to apply the mud. That way I fill everything up and there's not going to be any air bubbles. Make sure you really push that hot mud into the seam. That way you know everything's nice and filled. And I'm practically removing most of the mud except for what's in the seam. This is just going to help make it not look bumpy. Next, I'm going to be applying this fiber fuse tape over the seam. This is going to help strengthen the patch even more, that way it doesn't crack in the future. You can also use paper or mesh tape. I just really like using this fiber fuse. What I really like about this fiber fuse tape is that it helps avoid any air bubbles compared to like paper tape. Okay, next, it's time to hide that tape, that way it doesn't look like a patch. And for that, I'm going to be using my 14-inch drywall knife to apply the mud. This is the first coat right here. I let that dry for about 10 to 15 minutes and then I applied the second coat. You want to make sure you're doing thin coats, that way it's not too bumpy, because if it is bumpy, it's going to be very noticeable, and the whole point is for it not to be as noticeable. It also helps to use a fan to speed things up a little bit, but if you're using joint compound, it's going to take forever to dry. That's why I like to use the hot mud, because I could finish these patches in a reasonable time. If your ceilings and your walls are flat, then you're pretty much almost done. All you have to do is just let it dry, sand it down, prime it, and paint it. But as you can see, the ceiling is textured, so I'm just going to prep for texture. But before that, I am going to prime the patch a little bit. This is going to help me find any imperfections on the patch. That way I can touch them up, because once I texture, that is it. I can't go back. And for the texture, I am going to be mixing up some joint compound. I like to use the green box. And a lot of people ask me why not use hot mud for the texture. And the main reason is because I'm going to be using my hopper and it'll just ruin my hopper if I use hot mud. I also like to mix the mud inside of a trash bag. That way I don't make a big old mess. But before I use my hopper, I do need to connect it to my compressor. After all that, I can now fill up the hopper with the joint compound and start shooting texture. Whenever you're shooting the texture, just make sure you're keeping a consistent pattern around the patch and also make sure it matches the existing texture already there. Sometimes it might be a little bit heavier and sometimes it might be a little bit light, so just make sure you're keeping an eye on that. And after I shot the texture, I let it set for about 5 to 10 minutes before I knocked it down. I like using the magic trowel just because it leaves a little bit better finish. You can also use your drywall knife, but you have to be careful not to put too much pressure because it can make lines around the patch. And if you got any value from this video, don't forget to follow and subscribe for more content like this. If you want to get any of the tools or materials that I use, you can get them in my Amazon storefront. They are affiliate links, so I do benefit monetarily if you're kind enough to use them. You can also get a lot of the stuff at Home Depot if you can't wait for them to get delivered. But anyways, now you probably see why I plastic everything off, just because that texture goes everywhere and I don't want to get anything dirty, especially in the kitchen. The containment also keeps all the dust inside, that way it doesn't get on top of the cabinets or the countertops. The customers really appreciated how clean I was and they were super happy with how the repair turned out. I'm not going to be doing the painting for this repair. They have their own painters, but what do you think of this repair? Let me know in the comments. Jalapeno Solutions. Boom!